Rancher lived alone for years, until the Bigfoot took him to an abandoned cabin. It didn't want me afraid, it wanted me to follow. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The wind came sweeping down from the Montana ranges, lashing across the brittle hills of grass and stirring the pines into a low, ancient whisper. Somewhere out on the trail, the lonely strains of a harmonica drifted in the air, mingling with the steady rhythm of hoofbeats pounding against a sun-baked path, red dust curling upward in the dying light of evening. That road led straight to a solitary ranch pressed hard against the edge of the forest. And there, at the very line where shadow met the trees, stood a figure far too large to be a man. Bigfoot. It didn't flee. It didn't charge. Instead, it turned the crunch of snow breaking softly beneath its weight. Then it glanced back as if offering a summons silent but impossible to refuse. I thought I'd die alone on this ranch. High on the Montana plateau, the winter wind rolled down from distant mountains, sweeping across the brittle prairie grass and rattling the wooden ribs of the horse barn until they groaned and creaked. Snow lay heavy on the ground, the last light of evening spilling pale and thin across the weathered fence rails. It was the kind of silence that belonged to a land long married to solitude. Elias Carter's ranch sat apart at the forest's edge, a small timber house surrounded by endless fields. Elias, a man past 40, once knew the bite of war, the crack of rifles, and the weariness of trails that stretched farther than a man's endurance. Now he lived with only his horses and the echoes of memory. His face carried the lines of time, his silver-gray eyes set deep with the habit of watching horizons where no greeting ever came. That evening, as he crossed by the barn to check the locks, Elias stopped cold. There, in the fresh fall of snow, footprints, enormous, deep, not like any creature he had ever hunted, nor any he'd ever heard men whisper about. His heart caught his breath, turning heavy as though the world itself was holding back a secret. A strange sense came over him, part dread, part pull, something that shook him out of the stillness he'd long accepted. From that moment on, Elias knew life beside the ranch fire would never again remain the same. And if it were you living alone on a lonely ranch like this and finding giant tracks stamped into the snow, what would you do? Part 1. The Encounter. Montana's afternoon carried on as it always did, a cold wind sweeping across the wide, empty prairie laced with the scent of fresh snow and the resin of pine from the forests beyond. Overhead, a murder of crows wheeled in circles, their shadows spilling over the white ground like spilled ink on canvas. Elias Carter slung his old Winchester across his shoulder, his boots striking hard against the frozen earth. That sound, firm, hollow, certain, echoed against the quiet. He had known gunfire since he was a young man, riding the cattle drives through the Texas panhandle when storms of dust swallowed both man and beast, and the crack of rifles was as common as the call of a crow. Those years had passed into memory now, leaving only echoes. The clash of shots, the whoop of riders, the thunder of hooves shaking the ground beneath him. All that remained today was the howl of the wind and the silence that seemed to stretch too far. Some nights, sitting alone by the fire, Elias swore he could still hear it, the faraway crack of rifles carried on the plains, as though the land itself remembered the men who had fallen for pride, for cattle, for land. Solitude piled on him like layers of dust no broom could sweep away. But that evening the silence cracked. By the trail near the barn, half buried in the fresh fall of snow, Elias stopped. Footprints. Enormous, deep, twice the length of any man's step. He froze, hand tightening on the rifle, though what stirred in him was not fear. It was something else, something he hadn't felt since youth, when the horizon promised more than it revealed, the sense that a mystery waited just beyond reach. The sunset spread gold across the pines, light sifting through the thin veil of mist like strands of silver thread. Elias stepped deeper into the timber snow, crunching beneath his boots, each breath drifting white in the fading air. He thought of the old stories he'd heard around the campfires, tales of travelers vanishing in the Bitterroot Mountains, of bloodstains on snow with no body to be found. They called them Wild West stories, half truth, half whiskey-born imagination meant to scare boys into listening. Elias had laughed at them once. But here, in this frozen silence, laughter felt far away. A branch cracked. The sound snapped sharp and close enough to jolt him into alertness. Elias turned rifle, raised his heartbeat quick, but his eyes, steady eyes that had once seen men fall in battle and watched cattle stampede through choking walls of dust. And there between the towering trunks a figure appeared, massive, upright, dark against the snow. Only a few yards away, it did not charge, it did not flee. Sunset light clung to the thick coat of fur, catching flecks of snow in its strands. And Elias understood in an instant the stories weren't just stories. The moment stretched like a lifetime. Elias stood with his rifle trained. The creature stood still, eyes glowing amber in the last rays of daylight. No growl, no threat, only a gaze. And in that gaze, Elias saw no predator's hunger, no beast's hollow stare. What he saw was intelligence, awareness, and beneath it all, a sorrow deep and quiet. It startled him. A man who had pointed a gun at wolves, at cougars, even at other men when pressed to it, yet here he was, unable to will his finger to the trigger. The wind rose snow blowing into his face. Two figures, a man and a legend, stood in a hush so deep it seemed the whole forest listened. A whisper stirred inside Elias, faint but undeniable. "This is not your enemy." Slowly he lowered the barrel, not out of weakness but out of recognition. In the West, men learned a truth. Sometimes survival meant not pulling the trigger. The creature held its ground, then tilted its head slightly as though it understood, as though it had been waiting for that answer. The wind moved through the pine's branches, shaking like the toll of distant bells. Elias thought of the eyes he had seen in border towns, the suspicion when he entered a saloon, the calculation at cattle auctions, the guarded stares of travelers burdened with questions they'd never voice. But none of those eyes looked like this. Quiet, unjudging, peering past his scars and straight into his soul. And in that moment, something stirred in him, a feeling foreign yet undeniable, as if his years of wandering, of battles and loss, had all led him to this single instant to stand before a legend and not be afraid. The light drained fast from the sky. The creature shifted one step back, snow crunching underfoot. Then it stopped waiting. The air stretched taut like an old saddle strap about to snap. Elias drew a long breath, the cold biting deep into his lungs. His hand still rested on the rifle, but his heart urged him forward. He knew with certainty one decision: turn away and vanish into the safety of routine, or step forward into the unknown, would open a trail that could never be undone. And as Bigfoot loomed, still silent as a mountain, Elias asked himself, if it were you standing in that wilderness, staring into the eyes of a legend at dusk, would you walk away? Or would you take the step forward? Part 2. The summoning Bigfoot took another step back, then turned away. Its massive fur-clad shoulders melted into the dark of the forest, leaving only the outline of its figure caught in the fading silver light. Elias Carter stood, frozen hands stiff, with cold heart pounding uneven, like the pause before a pistol cracks in a town square duel. The creature didn't vanish like a ghost. It walked, slow, heavy. Each step pressed deep into the snow, leaving prints so large, so deliberate, they felt less like marks of passage and more like a challenge. Ignore this if you dare. After several steps, it stopped. The great head turned, amber eyes glowing through the dusk. No words, no sound. Yet Elias felt it like a call reverberating deep in his chest. He had lived through many summons in his life. The whistle of trains pulling drifters west, the crack of rifles when cattle stampeded, the sharp bark of a poker dealer in some border town saloon. But never before had an invitation come, clothed in such absolute silence. Elias took a single step forward. The snow broke beneath his boot, echoing through the hush. A choice made, a choice he could never walk back. He followed the trail. The distance between him and the creature never closed, yet never widened. When Elias stopped, it stopped. When he moved, it moved. The path narrowed, covered deep in snow, drawing into the woods where the sunset filtered only as thin crimson threads. The wind whipped through the branches like a whip cracking in an empty corral, stirring memories of Texas sandstorms of herding cattle through chaos ropes pulled taut as the beasts bucked and thundered against the earth. The vision came alive in his mind, cattle surging in panic hooves, beating like drums, clouds of dust turning the world red. Gunfire splitting the air, not fired at enemies but at the heavens, meant only to drive the herd back into order. Those shots once kept his blood alive, his sense of belonging intact. But when the dust settled, when the gunfire faded, he was still alone, just as he was now. Only this time at the end of this snow-covered trail, something waited. A strange emotion pressed against his ribs. He realized what unsettled him was not the creature ahead. It was that his long, unbroken silence was being shattered. Bigfoot stopped again. Its prints sank deep, dark hollows in the snow. It turned halfway back, head tilted, waiting. Not commanding, not demanding, just waiting. Elias's hand gripped the Winchester, not in defense, but out of habit. Like a cowboy clinging to the reins of a wild horse or a traveler clutching the last bundle he owned as strangers watched with suspicion in a border town street. He knew that look. All his life out west, he'd seen eyes that waited for his lead cattle before a river crossing horses, before a storm. A child in town gazing after the cowboys, dreaming a life he could not name. And now he himself was the one being asked. Invited. An invitation without words, but heavier than any knock on a door. The path grew steeper. Branches bowed low with snow snapping against his shoulders. Elias bent, exhaling streams of white fog into the frozen dusk. Halfway up the rise, he stopped, leaning on his knee. The cold cut sharp into his skin, and another night came rushing back, the blizzard and Wyoming cattle scattering in panic, cowboys screaming themselves, horse pistols cracking against lightning's flash. He had trembled then too, but he'd kept the saddle tight and led the herd through the storm. Survival, he'd learned, wasn't about strength. It was about standing firm when fear wanted you to yield. And so it was now. Each step he took wasn't just after some legend, it was a trial, a test of whether courage still lived in him. Bigfoot turned again, eyes steady on Elias. A question hung in their glow. Do you still have the strength? Elias straightened, fist tight, and forced one more step. The fog thickened, swallowing the trail. Only the line of giant tracks remained to guide him. Behind his breath, memories thundered back, rifles cracking in the night. Cattle scattering strange eyes in smoky saloons. All of it pulsed together into a rhythm, beating hard inside his chest. The creature kept on, slow, deliberate. Yet each glance back was a lantern held high, not to command, but to lead. At a bend in the path, it halted again. Its amber eyes burned through the mist, lingering on Elias longer than before. No need for words, Elias understood. This was no longer chance. This was the true invitation. Step forward or stay behind. The wind roared through the canyon, carrying a deep, ancient rumble like drums from another age. Elias drew breath hands, trembling eyes bright with something he hadn't felt in years. And I ask you, listening to this story now, if such a creature turned back to you, its gaze an unspoken summons, would you have the courage to follow? Or would you retreat to the safety of your own silence? Part 3. Through the forest. The deep woods of Montana were nothing like the deserts or prairies Elias Carter once rode across. The wind carried no red dust, only the damp, biting chill of old snow drifting through the pines like the weary sigh of the mountains themselves. Each step sank deep, the crunch of frozen crust loud beneath his boots, mingling with the rasp of his breath. Ahead of him, Bigfoot moved with the steady weight of a mountain come alive. It no longer turned often to glance back, but each shift in its path was marked with clear, cavernous prints, as if some invisible tether kept Elias bound to follow. His mind wandered back to the cattle storms of his youth. He remembered the Texas panhandle when sandstorms swallowed the horizon and herds screamed wild, their eyes red with panic, stampeding like a flood let loose. Cowboys shouting, rifles cracking into the gale, all of it drowned in dust and fear. Elias had once sworn if he could survive nights like those, nothing left in this world could shake him. But now, in the frozen hush of this forest, he found his body trembling not from fear, but from anticipation. Anticipation of what lay ahead. A secret, a truth, a trial greater than any storm the West had ever thrown at him. A sudden snap, a branch giving way. Elias stiffened, not from Bigfoot. Off the trail, on the bark of a pine, fresh gouges scarred deep into the wood. He bent low, fingertips brushing the splinters, still warm. A chill rose through him, sharper than the cold. This forest was not his alone, and not Bigfoot's alone either. Night bled quicker than he expected. The last wash of sunset faded behind the ridges, leaving only a purple-blue haze draped across the sky. Elias pulled his collar, high eyes fixed on the trail of giant tracks before him. Through a narrow valley, he came upon a smudge of gray in the wind. Smoke, faint but real. He dropped to one knee, brushing snow aside. Beneath the crust lay charred wood. A fire burned low not long ago. The embers still carried warmth. He lifted his head, scanning the shadows. The wind whistled through the branches, scattering the ashes like starlight across the snow. In his ears came the echo of another night-long past gunfire snapping in the dark, the bawl of panicked cattle, the shouts of men caught off guard as raiders swept in. Fire guns smoked blood on the snow. Where there was fire, there had been people. And if people had been here, there was a story. Perhaps a lost traveler. Perhaps a fugitive. Elias thought of the eyes he'd seen in border town saloons, eyes that wanted to trust yet worked hard to bury secrets. Somewhere in these woods, such eyes were watching, though he had not yet met them. At the edge of a frozen creek, Bigfoot halted. It turned slightly amber gaze, falling on Elias, a silent message in its look. You see now, it isn't only me. Elias stood still. And for the first time in many years, he felt the weight lift, the weight of believing he was the only soul carrying an untold story. Here in the silence of the forest, he understood others bore their secrets too. And tonight, he was not alone. The creek before him was frozen solid, its surface a milky sheet of ice reflecting the lonely crescent moon overhead. Wind whistled through the canyon, low and hollow, like the ancient drums of an army long gone. Bigfoot stepped first. The ice cracked under its massive weight, but held firm. Each stride was measured steady, like it had crossed this bridge 100 times before. Elias stood at the bank, his hand locked tight around the rifle's grip. Another memory surged back, a night driving cattle across the Pecos. The river had run wild, and furious horses, screaming steers, bawling cowboys, firing shots skyward to calm the chaos. He remembered Charlie, his closest friend, swept away by the current, his cry lost forever in the roar of water. The cold of tonight made that memory too real, his hand trembling as if the water still pulled at him. He drew a breath and stepped onto the ice. It groaned sharp and splitting through the canyon air. Yet with each step, the fear ebbed. By the time his boots struck the far bank, his heartbeat had steadied like a gambler walking away from a bet hard won. Bigfoot waited there silent in the moonlight. Its amber eyes held him, and in them, Elias felt the truth. He hadn't just crossed a creek, he'd crossed the line between who he had been and who he must become. The trail bent upward into a mountainside veined with ice and rock. The trees thinned, revealing jagged stone gleaming sharp as a blade. The valley winds rose, stinging his face with snow and faint ash carried from somewhere unseen. Elias climbed, each breath ragged, each step heavier than the last. His mind flashed to the days of his youth, driving cattle into storms that swallowed the sun. Once on a slope much like this, he'd been thrown knees bloodied, half buried in dust. But he had risen, gripped the reins, and pressed on. Not for pride, for survival. This slope was no different. Another test, asking if he could still stand. A sudden gust struck hard, pitching him sideways. He dropped to one knee palm, scraping rock. When he raised his head, Bigfoot stood ahead, unmoved, fur whipping in the gale, a monument of resolve. It turned eyes, questioning him. Will you stand as you once did? Elias ground his teeth, pressed his hands to the stone, and rose. Pain flared in his knee, but his gaze held steady. One step, then another, and he climbed on. In his chest came a sound, not gunfire, not stampeding hooves, just the pounding of his own heart, fierce and unbroken. Halfway up the ridge, the forest parted to a small clearing. The snow thinned, revealing dark soil scarred with use. There, scattered along the ground, lay split firewood still fresh, and a circle of ash gone cold, but still laced with smoke's bitter scent. Elias knelt, hand-brushing the wood. It hadn't lain long. Someone had been here recently. He lifted his gaze, unease gnawing at him. Beside the fire, a knife stood buried in the earth. The blade was rusted, but the hilt he knew. His hand shook as memory surged. Sam Granger, his friend who vanished 10 winters ago in a storm, had carried one just like it. The chill that gripped Elias came not from the wind, but from recognition. He stared around the hollow, every mark whispering of a life lived and lost in these very woods. Bigfoot lingered at the tree line, half its form hidden in shadow. It did not move closer nor fade away. It only watched those amber eyes steady, as if to say, "I brought you here not to frighten you, but so you would know." In that moment, Elias understood. This journey through the forest was not a trial of muscle or grit. It was a washing clean of memory, a reckoning with loss he'd long buried. He had thought himself doomed to die alone, the past locked away behind silence. But here in this cold wilderness, he was shown that memory never truly vanishes. It waits for the courage to seek it. His hand trembling, Elias pulled the knife free. The weight of it brought heat to his chest. His eyes burned, though no wind struck them. When he lifted his gaze, Bigfoot had already stepped back, fading deeper into the dark. Elias exhaled, slow, steady. He knew this was only the beginning. "And I ask you, listening now, if such a creature led you across forests, rivers, and mountains to reveal the forgotten traces of your past, would you keep walking forward or turn back to the safety of what you already know?" Part 4. The Abandoned Cabin. Another ridge fell behind him, and there, half buried among the pines, Elias caught sight of a low roofline. A cabin. Its weathered timbers hunched in the shadows, a crooked door rattling softly in the wind. His heart thudded heavy in his chest. Out here in the West, abandoned cabins were no rarity, some raised by drifters, others by prospectors who struck nothing and moved on, and sometimes by men who didn't want to be found. But this one felt different. It carried the breath of a story he somehow already knew. Elias laid his hand on the latch. A memory flickered nights driving cattle huddled with his crew in a shack against the wind rifles ready as bandits prowled in the dark. The flicker of lamplight on rough-hewn planks, the weight of silence before gunfire broke it. This cabin breathed that same tension, shelter, and secret in one. He pushed the door. Hinges groaned. The dark yawned open like the throat of memory itself. Inside, silence pressed thick. Elias struck a match. The flame trembled, casting long shadows across a room left in mid-breath. Dust coated everything. A table chair slumped to one side, a cracked shelf. On the table sat an empty lamp beside it, a teacup split in two. The air was heavy, as though the life within had been snuffed out mid-sentence. He trailed his fingers over the tabletop. Dust clung thick, each grain a year gone by. Each winter of solitude he himself had carried on the ranch. On the wall hung a frame, gray with neglect, the wood swollen with age. He brushed away the dust. Faces emerged, smiling, still frozen in time. A man, a woman, a child. Elias's breath caught. The man's face. Samuel Granger, his friend, the one swallowed by a blizzard 10 years ago. The room seemed to spin. Voices of long nights returned, he and Sam by the fire, talking of cattle, of futures, of wives and children they might one day raise. The sound of it now was like hooves drumming the plains alive again inside his chest. This was no empty cabin. This was memory-given walls. He stepped deeper. On a shelf lay a wooden box, its lock rusted through. Elias wedged it open with his knife. Inside scraps of cloth, a tattered Bible, and his hand froze a dagger. The hilt bore the initials E.C., his own. It was the very knife he'd given Samuel years ago on a Kansas cattle run, a brother's pledge forged in steel. Samuel had laughed, said he'd carry it to the end. And here it lay proof he had survived the storm, for a while at least. Elias's hand trembled as he lifted it. His eyes stung not from the smoke of the dead fire, but from the weight of what it meant. Sam had lived. He had fought on. He had left this marker behind. Outside, wind howled through the cracks, rattling the boards like gunfire in the distance. Elias raised his eyes to the doorway. Bigfoot stood there, half shrouded in mist, still, watchful. No words were needed. Elias understood. The creature had led him here not for fear, but for truth. He sank into a chair knife across his palm. In his mind flashed every stare he'd borne in border towns, the suspicion, the pity, the doubt when he spoke of Samuel, and the eyes of cattle waiting for him to lead them across storm and river. But none of those eyes were like this creature's steady, unjudging granting recognition. Sometimes acknowledgement doesn't come from men. Sometimes it comes from the very shadows, from the legends whispered around campfires. Elias rose, the dagger in hand. His gaze lingered on the photograph, the empty lamp, the broken cup. Silent messages Samuel had lived here. Samuel had hoped, and Samuel had in time left. A gust swept in, snuffing the match to black. The cabin vanished into shadow again. In that darkness, Elias heard only his own heartbeat steady alive. When he stepped out, Bigfoot stood firm at the threshold, then drifted backward into the woods, swallowed by the mist. Elias clenched the knife, and what filled him was not fear, not comfort, but reconciliation. He no longer bore the weight alone. Behind him the cabin lay still like a chapter closed. Before him the night spread open, and within him a new flame burned against the cold. And I ask you listening now, if you stepped into an abandoned cabin and found something once belonging to the dead, would you believe their story had ended, or that it was still waiting to be told? Part 5. The Unspoken Message. The cabin door swung wide, wind howling through the frame, carrying the bite of snow and the must of rotting wood. Elias stepped out, the knife carved with his initials still clutched in his hand. He lifted his eyes, but the space before him was empty, filled only with swirling gusts. Bigfoot was gone. Where moments before its massive figure had loomed at the threshold, now there remained only tracks pressed deep into the snow, trailing into the forest's darkness. No backward glance, no sound. Elias lingered on the porch. His heartbeat was slow but heavy, like the deep drums of a stampede breaking loose across the plains. In his chest stirred the echoes of long nights, past gunfire cracking across the range, bandits riding like phantoms through red dust storms, the chaos of cattle breaking wild. Back then, survival meant your brothers turned back to see if you were still standing. But this creature was different. It didn't need to look back. It knew Elias would understand that bringing him here was enough. No further words were required. He lowered himself onto the worn wooden step, snow collecting across his shoulders. His eyes followed the tracks stretching into the dark timber. Each print was like a silent punctuation mark writing a story no tongue could ever tell. He opened his hand. The knife gleamed faintly in the moonlight, its blade dull with years yet bright with meaning. It was more than steel. It was a bond, a lifeline to Samuel Granger, the friend he had believed lost a decade ago. A memory rose sharp as grit in the wind. A sandstorm in New Mexico, cattle stampeding blind cowboys, firing their pistols into the sky to keep the herd from breaking apart. Through the roar and chaos, Samuel's voice had cut through, "Don't let them lose their direction." That cry had haunted Elias for years, an echo of failure, a wound that never healed. And now Bigfoot had left no cry, no command, only a cabin and a knife, a gift of silence powerful enough to split his heart open. In the Wild West, men swore oaths with bullets, with whiskey, with blood. But Elias understood now the deepest promise required none of those. It was given in presence, in action, in the leading of another soul across forests, rivers, and mountains, into truths no man could reach alone. He exhaled white breath dissolving into the night wind, and for the first time in years inside the solitude that had bound him, Elias felt something stir. He was not entirely left behind. Elias rose from the cabin steps and took a few paces into the open clearing. Snow fell harder now, wind stinging his face raw, yet his eyes held fast to the line of massive tracks leading away into the night. Each print called up memories of the West he had once roamed, rifle fire echoing across empty plains, when cattle broke wild red storms sweeping Texas until day turned to night, and the wary eyes of strangers in border town saloons, half trust, half suspicion, hands always close to iron. Through all those years, Elias had carried one question. Was I ever on the right trail, or was I only riding to outrun the emptiness Samuel had once told him? You can ride every mile of the West, but sooner or later you'll circle back to where you began. And now, staring at the path Bigfoot had left, Elias understood. Some roads do not lead to town, some do not lead to ranch or home. They lead backward into memory, into the things we bury and the truths we pretend to forget. Bigfoot had spoken nothing. It needed no words. Its tracks were the message. The rest is yours to uncover. Darkness thickened. The forest sank into black, the wind tearing through the high pines with a mournful howl like the cry of a broken fiddle drifting over a wasteland. Elias struck his last match, then let it gutter out. Shadows closed over him. He listened to the slow, heavy drum of his heart, the pulse in his ears like running water. And in that stillness, a revelation came. Bigfoot had taught him what no man could, how to listen to silence. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of death, but the silence of passing on a wordless trust, like an old cowboy's steady gaze at a younger man across the fire, saying, without saying, I believe in you. Elias sat again on the porch step, snow gathering across his hat and shoulders. Sounds of the past rippled in his mind, gunshots, cattle bawling, the hiss of prairie winds, until they softened, yielding to the forest's hush. And in that hush he grasped it. Bigfoot had left him a gift. A nod unseen, an acknowledgement unspoken that he was worthy of memory, worthy of knowing, worthy of moving on. The moon rode high over the timber, casting a silver path along the trail. Elias Rowe's fingers closing firm around the dagger. He stepped out once more, following the track that stretched into the wild. Already the prints were fading beneath the new snow. Each one marked the legend, and each one was already being erased by time. His chest ached with the weight of it, loss and blessing both at once. Faces swirled in his thoughts, suspicious stares across saloon tables, cold eyes over cards, the panicked eyes of cattle in storm, and Samuel's face in that last fleeting glance before the blizzard swallowed him whole. All of them now bound together with the amber eyes of Bigfoot. And he understood. What the creature had left was not merely a knife, not merely a cabin, not even the prints themselves. It was a message that required no words. You are not alone. Your past has its witness, and some things still live if you dare to face them. Elias lifted his head, the wind tugging through his silver hair, his eyes shining beneath the moon. He felt as though a lost piece of his soul had been returned, not by whiskey nor by gun, but by the silence of a legend. Turning from the cabin, he started down the slope. Snow cracked beneath his boots. Behind him, something closed. Before him, something opened. And I ask you, listening to this tale, if a silent creature led you through forest and storm, showed you the traces of your past, and then vanished without return, would you call it a loss, or the last gift you were meant to receive? Night wind rattled the wooden window frame, carrying with it the scent of fresh snow and the resin of pine from the forest beyond. Inside the small ranch house, the fire cracked and flared, its red glow dancing across the weathered lines of Elias Carter's face. On the table before him lay the dagger, its hilt carved with EC. The steel caught the firelight in a dull gleam, and when Elias set his calloused hand upon it, it felt as though he were touching more than iron. It was a fragment of a soul, a shard of the past he once believed lost forever. He lifted his gaze toward the window. Outside, the timberline loomed black and silent. No sound, no massive figure standing guard in the snow. Yet Elias stared as if he knew somewhere in that wilderness, amber eyes still watched him in return. And in the hush of his heart, he heard the message. Some secrets are given only to those willing to step beyond their safe ground. Silence held. Then, Elias drew a long breath, raised a small glass of whiskey, and let the heat roll into his chest. For the first time in years, the ranch did not feel too wide, too empty. It felt as though something still waited for him out there in the trees, in the unspoken stories, perhaps even in the company of the very creature that had carried him through this journey. Beyond the walls, the wind swept a hollow cry down the valley, a sound like music from the Old West itself, where cowboys once rode in dust storms and brothers laid a hand on each other's shoulders without needing a promise. Elias opened his eyes, the firelight sparking bright in them. If Bigfoot came again tomorrow, he would follow. And if it did not, he had already been given its gift, an unspoken truth, a wordless grace. And I ask you, if a creature of legend led you to what had long been forgotten, would you have the courage to step inside? If you were the rancher, would you have stayed or ridden away into the wild? Let me know in the comments.